TRE.
Talk Radio Europe.
You're locked in to TRE in the afternoon with Hannah Murray.
Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is Alex Madva. He's a professor of philosophy and director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy. He's also a co-author of Somebody Should Do Something, How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. It's an inspirational read for anyone who feels overwhelmed by the world's problems and wants to do something that really matters. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be joining you from across the pond.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. So, it sounds like you have a couple of interesting jobs, being the director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy. What does that entail?
That's a center at my campus at Cal Poly Pomona, where we are trying to raise awareness about contemporary national and international problems, but sort of focus on them through a Californian lens. So how do issues like the climate crisis and misinformation affect Californians and all their diversity and complexity, and what opportunities are there for Californians to take leadership in addressing them?
Yeah. I mean, you have to start local, don't you, with all these things? You can't it's difficult to try and take on the world. You've got to start with your own neighborhood.
Absolutely. That's a central organizing idea in my center, and also in the book that I just co-wrote with Dan Kelly and Michael Brownstein. And it's also a topic that I heard you take up yesterday with Tom Doherty on climate anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. It was similar. I mean, yours, it does talk about climate change, but also racism specifically. How did you decide on these two topics particularly?
That's a great question. Those are two of the fundamental issues of our time. Originally, we also wanted to talk about misinformation, but then the book would have been much longer and much more expensive, so we had to make some difficult choices. But two features that both the climate crisis and racism have in common is that, on the one hand, we were basically brought up through advertisements and through our education to think about these issues in a fundamentally individualistic way. There's a famous ad on climate change that said, people start pollution and people can stop it. And that's sort of focusing us on what, we can do as specific individuals. And similarly with racism, we learned about specific heroes like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And we were taught to believe that as long as you as an individual are treating other individuals with respect, you're doing all you need to do to fight racism. But in both cases, in the last 5, 10, 15 years or so, there has been a tremendous raising of awareness that these problems can't just be solved at the individual level, that they're fundamentally structural in nature, that they have to do with the ways our society is organized, our laws, our built environments, where people live, and so on. And then basically the core idea of the book is, okay, great, now I've realized that these problems are structural, but what can I do to create an international treaty to reduce carbon emissions? It seems impossible for me to make a difference at the individual level. So we're trying to encourage folks to think about themselves as agents of change in a broader struggle to bring about bigger systemic changes.
Yeah. And you talk about in the book, when referring to racism, that a lot of people might think that, racism is only people who have real hatred in their hearts. But it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of sort of undertones to it all. And people might say out loud, oh, I'm not racist. Of course I'm not racist. That's awful. But then they might think certain things, say certain things, and actually they are.
Absolutely. And they might choose to send their children to certain schools that just coincidentally happen to be predominantly white. Or they might choose to live in neighborhoods that are they think it's just a nice neighborhood, but again, coincidentally, it's predominantly white. And lo and behold, we end up with a society where people of different social groups are clustered into different areas. And some of those areas that are predominantly occupied by people of color end up having worse schools, and they have less access to police in some ways, but maybe they're over-policed in other ways. Maybe there are more environmental toxins in those neighborhoods. And so that's another reason that we think about both climate change and racism in the book, is that the two are intimately related. For example, something like 80 to 90% of the plastic incinerators in the United States are in communities that are predominantly people of color.
Yeah, interesting. And with regards to racism, I think a lot of people, maybe white people, I guess, would think that it's not as big a problem as it used to be. And we've seen a lot of positive change in the world, and it's, not so much of a big deal. But that sadly isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to bring up that there has been a lot of progress. So if you go back to the 1920s, in both Europe and the United States, if you ask people what they thought about members of other racial groups or religious groups or ethnic groups or members of other countries, they were pretty much just openly racist. They would say, I would never let that person marry my child, or I wouldn't want them to live in my neighborhood. And then a whole lot of stuff happened in the 20th century. Obviously, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. And by the time you get to the early 1980s, most Americans said that they opposed race discrimination in nearly all its forms. And maybe that's just some folks are telling pollsters what they think the pollster wants to hear. But I think most people genuinely in their hearts don't want to be racist anymore. And then, but the problem is that we've already built up our institutions in ways that are systematically advantaging some people and disadvantaging others. So even though there has been important progress in some ways, we have a legacy of racist institutions that is still structuring people's outcomes even today.
Yeah. There's a lovely cartoon, I think, that I've seen a few times over the years. I saw it again quite recently, actually, that somebody shared on social media, and it was two young boys. One was black, one was white, and the white boy was asked what were the main differences between him and his friend, and he said, well, he's much better at maths than I am. And, it's like they don't even, when kids at a young age, depending on the upbringing and all kinds of other influences, but for the most part, they don't see colour as a difference at all. It's not something that needs to be mentioned. It's all in personality. He's better at football than me. I'm better at geography than he is. They don't think, oh, he's a different colour to me at all. That's something generally that starts to happen to some people as they get older.
That's a fair point, although this is actually a topic that we take up in our book. Kids are really smart, and even though they might be totally open to having friends of different racial groups, and they're not necessarily going to start thinking this person is inherently inferior to me, they do watch all the TV that we watch, or a lot of it anyway, and they walk when they're traveling with their parents on the subway. They see that they're going through different neighborhoods and people dress in different ways. And actually, at a remarkably young age, children are really good at knowing which groups in society are more advantaged than others. And they've tested this across a bunch of different places and a bunch of different dimensions of race and ethnicity and religion, where children already become aware that some folks are more advantaged or disadvantaged than others. But some of the good news here is that for parents who are willing to talk about those things with their children and tell them, some people don't get treated as fairly in society, but those are not our values. We have to fight against it. That parents who are aware of these issues and committed to fighting back against them can help to instill those values in their children. So as their children become increasingly aware of what's going on in the world, they don't just assume, this group is worse off in society because they're not as smart or they don't work as hard, but because there are systems that are standing in their way. Yeah. And those becoming aware in those ways is a key piece towards becoming the kind of individual who is going to join the broader fight for social change and not just accept the status quo.
It's a big responsibility for parents as well to pass the right kind of views down onto their kids. You know, kids will grow up for a long time, I think, believing what their parents tell them, being influenced by what their parents tell them. And if their parents are racist and are coming out with really horrendous statements, oh, don't trust them because they look like that, or make sure you look after your belongings when you're around that person, or whatever it might be, really awful, judgmental and racist statements, the kids will hear these things and just think, that's what's right, that's what's correct, that's what my parents have told me. And it's a real responsibility for parents to explain to children that, you know, you shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin, basically.
Absolutely. It's a real responsibility for parents. It's a real responsibility for teachers, and it's also a responsibility for peers. So research finds that, you know, even for folks who might have grown up in an insular context or even a racist context, their peers can be incredibly influential on them as well. And so, for example, if you have, if during your time in university, if your roommate is a member of a different race, or if your roommate is politically active, those kinds of effects can have enduring influences on people for years to come. And so a kind of central idea in the book is that we have to think about all the different social roles that we occupy: a parent, a teacher, a student, a friend, an employee, a boss. And in each one of the roles that we occupy, there are certain opportunities we have to make a change. And so not just thinking it's my job just to go into class and teach students math, but it's also my job to go into class and teach students how to respect each other and teach students to care about bringing about a better social world.
Yeah. You also talk in the book about the either or thinking and how that's one of the biggest obstacles for people to make changes. What do you mean by that?
Right. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier. We were brought up to think that the only thing to do is just make sure that if we're talking about the climate change, just make sure that you're recycling, that you're buying an EV, that you're not, wasting a lot of energy, or in the case of racism, that you're treating every other individual with respect. And those are things that are focused on what you can do as an individual. But then as we became aware that these are broader structural problems, then it seemed like those sorts of individual level things we could do aren't going to make a difference in the big systemic changes. So when we switch to thinking about systemic stuff, then it becomes really unclear what role I as an individual have to play. And so there are a number of different either or thinking traps that we talk about in the book, but the central one is something like either I can act as an individual, but then my actions don't matter, or I can try to change the system, but what could I possibly do to change the system?
Yeah.
So instead we advocate for both and thinking, where our individual actions do matter, but the fundamental actions we can take are those where we work together with others to bring about structural change. And conversely, when we're thinking about changing systems, it's not just about passing laws and expecting everybody to get along on board, because history is littered with examples of trying to pass, for example, carbon taxes, but then they get they end up getting repealed or have huge carve-outs in them where they don't actually have the effects that people intend because they didn't secure individual buy-in. And so we also have to be thinking about making structural changes that empower individuals to act the way that we want them to.
Yeah. In the book, you talk to various people who are already doing amazing things. Can I ask you about some of them?
Absolutely.
The Amazon warehouse unionizers.
Yes, so Chris Smalls and Angelica Maldonado and a few other individuals were instrumental in creating the first union in an Amazon warehouse. And it's a very interesting story in terms of these things, because one of the main actors in the story, Chris Smalls, did not start out trying to be an agent of social change. Originally, he actually wanted to play basketball. He got injured. He was a rapper for a little while, but then he had kids, and so he had to get jobs. And eventually he found himself working in an Amazon warehouse. And then the COVID pandemic hit, And he was concerned that they weren't being given enough personal protective equipment, that they weren't, taking proper safety precaution guidelines. And so he started to change his thinking. Instead of just thinking about keeping his head down and doing his job, he became oriented towards trying to change the system. And bit by bit, he worked with other folks to try to bring about larger structural changes. And they staged the first walkout in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. He was immediately fired the next day, but that sort of only made his cause even more important. They tried to create, they did create a messaging group where they could talk to people about these issues. But they said that simply doing stuff on social media and texting wasn't what really made the difference. What really made the difference was hanging out in the break room, standing outside, showing up day after day after day and trying to talk to people. And bit by bit, one by one, they got one petition after another and eventually worked together to create the first union in an Amazon warehouse. And we're optimistic that this is an example of a turning point where there's growing bottom-up support, where people are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder and work together to bring about structural change.
Yeah, amazing. And one of the things that came up in yesterday's interview was the importance of joining forces. Change doesn't happen alone, and finding people that have the same kind of belief system and drive as you can be crucial.
Absolutely. And it ties directly to what you were talking about yesterday in terms of climate anxiety, because if you feel like you have to do it alone, then things are going to feel impossible and it's going to be really painful and upsetting. But one thing that's also really clear from the research is that when you are working together with other people, it's not just an opportunity to make a difference. It also makes you feel good. And our book also describes cases of people protesting in authoritarian regimes where they don't really even think that they have a good chance of winning, but they have a strong sense of identity with each other in the fight. And I'm showing up for you and you're showing up for me. And that actually people also feel better. It's a source of meaning and purpose in their lives, which can really, so it really both empowers people, but it is also a really important part of mental health, that some of what matters the most to us is when we're showing up for others.
Yeah. I like the title as well. It's a bit sort of tongue in cheek, isn't it? Somebody should do something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our hope is that somebody is you, all the audience who's listening today. But I think it speaks to a familiar experience many people have had, where you're sitting there watching the news and something awful happened and you turn to the person next to you and say, somebody should do something. And without realizing that we are the people that we need in this moment.
Yeah, definitely. Powerful statement. Well, if people want to get a copy of Somebody Should Do Something, How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change, it's available on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Alex Madva and various others who've written the book. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Great to chat with you.
Hannah, this was such an honor. I'm so grateful. Thank you.